As you can imagine, the pandemic has delivered significant changes to the esports sector. The next session explores the evolving relationships between organisers, players, audiences and advertisers to gauge the response so far and what is needed for the sector to survive and to thrive. Following this, you can take part in a Q&A with the panellists, and don't forget the Meet the Researchers session, which is running parallel to this, and they can be joined in the session space. But for now, please join Heather Dower from HotDrop, who will be speaking with James Dean, founder and CEO of ESL UK subsidiary, and Anna Borman, who is Executive Vice President of Esports at Rect Global.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of today at the Beyond Conference. And we've got the absolute pleasure of discussing esports with you and how we responded to the pandemic and how we will continue to respond to difficult times and climates. And it's really interesting of the theme of divergence that we'll dissect with both James and Anna today, as divergence kind of talks about splitting away. And that's really what esports was able to do in 2020, thanks to the pandemic. Esports, as you might have come across in any form of like mainstream news or may have seen on social media, has been kind of a buzzword for, I would say, 20 years. And we've had to use sports analogies to describe what esports is. But this year has allowed us to split away from the shadows and really become our own sector and have its own spotlight shined on it. So we'll be exploring what we had to overcome. But the greatest thing that has happened is that pretty much every type of esports tournament that was taking place over the world was able to continue with only some small hurdles because of the research and the innovation that's been going on for years, and the way that the industry has kind of had to respond in a normal workflow and create its own workflows. So this is a great panel to be talking about at this conference today. Thanks, Joanna, for the introduction. I'm the CEO of HotDrop, a creative marketing agency. I was previously the marketing director at ESL, so I have my former boss on the panel with us today. But I also am joined by James Dean, the CEO of ESL UK, and then Anna Baumann from Rect Global. Anna gets to see and oversee global properties such as Team Rogue and London Royal Ravens, who are huge international esports teams. And James comes from the broadcast innovation and esports tournament organization background. So we've got a full 360 view on how esports has responded to the pandemic. And now I'm going to shut up and get James and Anna into the conversation as well. James and Anna, it's really great to have you both here. It would be great, Anna, if you could just describe what the scene looked like for you at Rect Global just prior to the pandemic for esports in general.
Yes, absolutely. Pleasure to do that. So maybe what's interesting about Rect Global is, yes, we have a huge esports department that is headed by me. And as you've already mentioned kindly, we have those two big esports teams, the Ravens as well as Rogue. However, Rect Global as a company is an esports marketing agency that services basically mostly big brands, bringing them on board in esports. So from our perspective, looking at this year, it has been quite crazy, but full of opportunity for esports. Esports has already been on the rise, as you've mentioned. We've seen enormous growth. Now coming to esports and overlooking our team properties, I think the most remarkable thing to say here is that we have just seen the rise in viewership amongst all our properties, but especially the LEC, which is one of our tentpole properties, where we have seen a year-on-year growth that is bigger than 100% here.
Thanks, Anna. And James, what was kind of this? How has esports grown through broadcasting and innovation, and how has it been used to the idea of having to make things work to do what we need to get esports out there?
Thanks, Heather, and obviously a pleasure to be here, albeit the sort of early morning shift, as it were. Now, I think what's really interesting, if we sort of rewind slightly, if we think about where esports basically came from, effectively, people came together playing video games in a multiplayer environment, and it was very much depicted by the network connectivity of some sort in order to be able to come together. So obviously, to begin with, we were in a kind of a physical environment. We had to connect PCs together in the same room on a LAN, and that's where the real multiplayer side of things built up very fast. Then we fast forward and the internet basically comes along, and effectively that allowed two things. Firstly, multiplayer gaming could be now vast. It could be worldwide, pretty much, sort of, depending on latencies, of course. But the second thing is that we were able to get the content out to the global audience too over the internet. The idea of broadcasting on traditional linear sort of platforms was far too cost prohibitive. It just would be impossible. And in fact, early stages of trying that just got completely shut down after a year or two, just based on the fact it just couldn't work financially. So when we started to really build and grow esports on the digital front, on the content distribution side, we saw platforms like Twitch pop up, and in 2015 it was purchased by Amazon, and at this point ESL and DreamHack were actually combined, servicing about 70% of that audience, but it was significantly smaller back then as well. We were talking, you know, millions a year, not quite the billion we're looking towards potentially this year or next. Obviously, when a global pandemic hits, a huge amount is disrupted. But fortunately, because we're in this kind of entirely digital sphere, all the players are playing online, everyone's viewing online, in theory, we can make a very quick divergence and continue operating. And that's what we did. And it's amazing, actually. We've got some amazing photos, or not so amazing photos, of our big flagship event, IEM Katowice, which usually attracts about 180,000 people over a weekend in Poland. And effectively, the decision by the Polish government to actually prevent physical audiences was that Friday. So we effectively had everything on site, the production, everything was set up, but ultimately these players, these teams who had flown in from around the world, were playing to an entirely empty stadium. Now, that doesn't sound so uncommon now. I think we've seen quite a few sports now starting to come back to play within empty stadiums, but that shock was incredible. And you know, just the fact that we were expecting such a large intake and then overnight it's just zero. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, is that the matches were able to continue on and the viewership was very, very high. And as Anna alluded to just shortly before, we started to see viewerships tenfold just during the pandemic, which was quite incredible. Obviously, not just put down towards the fact people are more likely at home and available, and there's less choice of competitive entertainment. But of course, as you were mentioning, Heather, it really did give a platform for esports to shine and break away from this sort of sporting analogy, because it is its own thing, and we're able to operate. So we've learnt a massive amount over the last few months, and we look forward to speaking about it now.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we're very used to being resilient and constantly evolving, and this really was the chance of where we thought we had everything sussed, but probably not, and still had to overcome and use innovation and expedite innovation potentially, which we'll talk about in studio sense, and elevating our broadcast to give something special back to the community, because that's what esports is all about. Anna, it'd be really interesting, and I've been dying to talk to you, hopefully at an event, but we'll do it on this panel instead. What was it like having, you know, teams like Rogue, for instance, in the LEC, which was in studio, with knowing that Worlds, one of the biggest tournaments literally in the world, was meant to be taking on site in China only a few months down the line? What kind of initial impacts did COVID have on a team like Rogue at the LEC?
I believe the very first impact has been very similar COVID had on many industries, and that is an enormous sense of well, uncertainty. Looking at the future, what's going to happen. We didn't know whether this would mean that we have to stop broadcasting from the studio basically for maybe 2 weeks, or would it take longer? So looking at how teams approach this, one thing that's really important to take into account is that we are performing at a very high peak. Our players are the very best in the world, and getting hit by this uncertainty makes it quite tough to maintain a certain level of performance, especially that might not be known to everybody in the audience here. For players, the LAN environment where you get offline on stage, this is considered the environment where you show your peak performance, you have zero ping, this is where you shine with your abilities. So when the players were met with, well, the demand to actually perform from our offices, the response was not very good, because obviously it's very hard for them to take the competition seriously at that point. However, I think we've been in a lucky position at Rec Global that we had already installed our in-house developed high performance environment, which is very much focused on establishing routines for our players to maintain a resilience no matter what happens in your physical or mental environment. And that has certainly helped to overcome the obstacles we've met in terms of participating in online competitions.
And it's funny, we've almost gone back to our roots, Anna, because the in-stage and James, like the on-stage tournaments are fairly new to the industry in terms of like that is where the peak performance was, and it all started off very remote and kind of like online with these terrible pings and questionable competitive integrity, I guess, yes. And having to be really regionally locked in a lot of those tournaments. So I guess, was that natural for some of your players to transition back to not being in that studio environment and being back in a room, or was it really a shock to the system again?
I think for us it was tough at the beginning, just because our players are very good, and they got a bit frustrated that this environment, as you mentioned, gave a bit of a competitive advantage to other teams who should have not been as good as they were than in an online environment. And that, of course, creates this frustration that I think is not apparent or visible to the fan or generally the broadcast, and then you get your performance get analyzed in this very, very different environment. And I think that's also not so obvious. But to be fair, I'll just give you a couple of examples that I think can illuminate how it's working on our end. So we've maintained all our routines we usually do in a LAN environment. That goes from meditation to other performance routines. For example, some of our players put their head underwater to force their bodies into a diver's effect. That is a complete mental reset, stuff like that. We just had this, in our office environment then as well. And on top of it, that players should wear their team attire, although of course that has been a bit of a fight, because you're working with very young individuals and they're like, yeah, I don't care, I'll come, they don't come in their PJs, but it is kind of tough. I think everybody knows this from working from home, to maintain the same attitude and seriousness when approaching performance in particular. So it has been tough. However, I think since we've gone online and back and forth quite a bit, we are now prepared to perform in whatever environment. But at first it was a shock to the system for sure.
Thanks, Anna. It would be interesting, James, on to compare on the broadcast side of things, how much the audience globally has such a high demand and expectation, and Anna will touch on like brand activations a little bit later in the chat, because I think that they coincide and they marry up very well. But James, you know, ESL is part of the Weaver consortium that was awarded the grant from the industrial strategy with UKRI, innovating broadcast literally, not for this purpose of a pandemic, but it seems like it was good timing this year. What has Weaver been working on and ESL to enhance that viewing experience, to give such a, I guess, a heightened experience for the viewers, because they can't be in the stadia anymore?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, because effectively esports doesn't happen in a physical environment for commercial reasons or for necessarily to the first state for the fan. It's actually for the competitive integrity, as Anna mentions. You and I use the example sometimes. If you think that a player will complain to you, a pro player will complain to you if the monitor isn't running at 144 hertz, and they can absolutely tell the difference between that and 120 and 160 hertz, that kind of gives you an idea, the fact that they can see the difference in that short amount of time in a second, that, you know, that environment is absolutely essential. However, obviously, once we created physical environments and fans could come together in one big place, that started a trend, and it's a very, very good experience. And you're getting a lot out of that. You're getting the hype moments, you're being there to support. It's the premium experience, right? And that's similar to any sport or other live entertainment. So obviously, from a tournament perspective, we have to then start to consider, okay, if it's all online, okay, maybe there's elements where we have to change, say, the format or consider some of the integrity elements of it. But what can we do to replace that physical kind of moment? And Weaver had actually set out to explore this exact topic while a physical event was happening. So the idea being is that we want to try and personalize and bring more immersion to a wider online audience that can't actually be in the stadium. So in a very almost serendipitous way, we found ourselves mid-pandemic with already a whole bunch of research and set of tools we had been working on in order to enhance that virtual experience. Now, for those who don't know about the Weaver project, you can have a look on weaver.tv. But effectively, what we're doing is looking at all forms of immersion, bringing them together, and then personalizing that experience one-to-one with each fan. So, you know, if we have 2 million fans watching, we want 2 million stories. And effectively, how we do that, we take the sort of visual immersion, you know, anything from VR to enhanced screen technologies or overlays and ways in which we can deliver more through audio as well, of course. And the second is the social immersion. It's absolutely imperative that you have a sense of belonging. We see that even more so in esports than anything else. The fact that effectively people are coming together online in the primary position because effectively that's where their friends are while they're playing games. They will meet people and they will have never met them in the real world until basically one of these LAN events happen or an event, and you know, time and time again we go to physical events and we're seeing people come together and they've known each other for 10 years and never met, which is quite nice, really. But that social immersion is super important because effectively we collate. And then finally, the cognitive immersion. Now, this is a really important component because what we're doing is we're taking as much data flow, bidirectional data flow, the information that can come from the fan, but also from the esport itself and the tournament. And we can use artificial intelligence and a bit of machine learning to really personalize that narrative. And that can be in textual form, or it can be in statistics, or it could be just creating something really good fun, like who's the MVP of the match, etc., or who used the flaming sword the most, or whatever. In effect, what we're doing is allowing for that one-to-one relationship with the big event, tournament, game, player, team, whatever, to that fan. And ultimately, what we're not trying to do is replace a physical tournament at all. What we're trying to do is enhance a physical tournament, but during this moment in time when everything's being run online, we can really eke out or extract as much as possible those exciting moments. And ultimately, the big goal is to figure out what sort of value chain can we create in order to potentially monetize either directly with the fan. There's lots of examples in esports where prize pools reach $42 million, and that's all contributed through microtransactions from the community. And of course, through B2B, so sponsors and brands and partners getting closer to that fan by delivering value too. So it's been a very exciting journey over the last few months, and again, a huge amount of divergence. But we've got some really good examples now of exactly how these fans are behaving and how we look forward to getting back into that physical space.
Thanks, James. I think the fans and the remoteness of the world right now has obviously helped increase the uplift of esports into the mainstream. And as Anna, as you mentioned, the viewership in LEC skyrocketing through the roof in terms of its year on year, and then boom again this year. And I think it's really interesting that when we've gone remote, everything we do as esports and industry, first and foremost, has really been about the fan even more so. And it's like, kind of, how smart do you have to be? Because we've used these tools, but how do we have to change and adapt to them? Anna, as a kind of a position in Rect Global, like, did you see any changes to the business model in terms of the approach for brand activations? Because sport obviously paused, and there was a lot of sponsorship requirements there, and we all know that too well in esports. Did you start to see opportunities and conversations potentially change at the beginning of this year when the pandemic suddenly put the sporting world on hold?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one thing to consider is when we had to go into an online environment overnight, that your inventory really changes. So beforehand, we had the inventory in the LEC, which meant, you saw, for example, the team jersey, you would see the chairs the players sit on. When we started in the online environment, we wouldn't have cameras at first, just because it was technically not feasible to connect all 10 offices at the same time with the broadcast. So in terms of what has changed, yes, for sure. Also, we in esports as well, in comparison to sports, had to sit down with our partners and figure out what we can make work and what we might not be able to make work. So one of our biggest partners, for example, Kia, has been fantastic in terms of working together over the year, and we shifted quite a bit from a campaign that was focused mostly on digital content, which then still had to be produced. So yes, digital content, but that means physically crews have to come together, record it, etc. So we needed to shift that quite a bit, and we had exciting, very creative results. So for example, one thing we shifted was that we replaced ads with what we thought was more fan engaging, with a pre-show to the LEC finals in summer, where the fans tuned in and all teams had their own digital segment. So our campaign was focused around our musical assets as well as the team. So we got Steve Aoki to perform, a custom set that was, especially for the LEC fans, for our Rogue fans. And we probably wouldn't have done that if the pandemic hadn't hit. He recorded this, remotely in his house in Las Vegas. And then we produced this really cool Twitch overlay, which I thought was hilarious, with a PPD, dancing. So overall, I think we had to adjust. I also believe that the digital space provides many creative solutions what you can offer to a brand. However, sometimes it is a bit tough to transition. So just to give another example that didn't directly affect us, but obviously the chair sponsor for the LEC, when we went online and the chairs weren't visible, there is something that we couldn't make work. And I think that remains a challenge now to really switch our approach to digital assets only for the time being.
Thanks, Anna. James, how does Weaver and ESL as a broadcast operator look to integrate and dynamically kind of integrate brand activations for things like, if Rogue wanted to do something kind of a broadcast from Australis at IEM kind of VITs, and to assist with them, maybe their brand activations or even the own tournament sponsorships? Is there anything you guys have been looking at with Weaver and virtual studios at all?
Yeah, so, and I just wanted to make a comment on, obviously as a tournament operator, we have a responsibility to our own partners, but of course we have a responsibility to the teams as well. And that sort of jersey wearing exposure or product placement or whatever just, wasn't in existence. And it's quite interesting actually. A lot of teams started to come up with fairly innovative ways, or very basic innovative ways, to try and get some of that exposure. So as soon as we could, with all these teams dispersed and basically playing from their professional offices, or training offices, should I say, or even from home in certain countries, we tried to get camera feeds from those players. It was really important to try and get at least a bit of reaction or some sort of excitement from a team winning or in a challenge within mid-tournament or something. And that worked quite well, and we did that extremely quickly, pretty much overnight. But some of the players were actually turning up with big sponsored banners behind them. So the little webcams that we were bringing in, or the video feeds, would have all of the team's own sponsors within the main broadcast. Now, if you think about that related to a physical tournament, that just wouldn't fly, because, for example, one of ESL's partners is Mercedes. So having Kia in the background may be seen as a conflict of interest. So with that in mind, it is still important. We need to try and figure out, well, how does this big mash of brands and partners come together? Firstly, on the tournament side of things, basically, because all of these experiences we'd been working on within Weaver were new, they're kind of fresh inventory, if you like. We had the Twitch overlay, the Twitch integration, which is, if no one's really familiar, it's effectively like a very enhanced OTT platform, red button type thing, which allows full interactivity on a personalized basis, on which you can kind of turn on and off and move around on your screen as you wish, as a fan, as a consumer. And we were able to deliver a huge amount of statistics, scheduling aspects of the tournament, and obviously it's crying out to offer more experience and interaction. And the obvious stuff is things like voting, or contributing to even the smallest decision making process within the tournament itself. So you call it like allowing the internet to have its say, which can be dangerous, of course. And that kind of made way for lots and lots of different branding prospects. But the virtual set is probably the ultimate, right? I think we've seen a massive influx of virtual sets around the world right now, and obviously we got straight to work with how we could adopt a space. Obviously, there was still the challenge about the fact that it's still a physical space, and in different countries were in different states of play during the various sort of progression of the pandemic, and lockdown impacted travel and the rest of it. And we're working with Doc10 as a consortium partner up in Manchester, and they've done a huge amount of work in this space. And what was most exciting was the fact that not only could we have branding, but we could also bring product placement back into the play. So we had very early versions of very simple, easy ways of bringing in, an entire Mercedes car, for example, or an energy drink can on the desk. But really, apart from that, it's just mind share. We still need to deliver value. It's no point in just creating a nice virtual space that looks pretty. You have to think about the opportunity beyond just the fact that we've got this digital playground. So effectively, and my mantra is always about don't use technology for the sake of it. I think the entire creative industry would agree with that. And effectively, what we're trying to deliver is every aspect of the technology we bring in cannot be implemented in some form of gimmick, in effect. So we thought about effectively delivering every single aspect of the data analysis, or even extracting more of the IP out of the game itself, such as characters, etc., into that space, and using them. And I suppose the big pinnacle, the big or the most recent advanced integration we've built out into that virtual space is effectively a copy of the tournament match map. So you can see the entire pitch, if you like, of the players while the match is happening in front of the analysts or commentators, and they're able to interact with that map, so they can start pointing out moments in time on a linear basis, what's happening, and visualizing that in a really effective manner, and quite an exciting manner, which sort of blends that opportunity to use a camera, a physical camera, to blend that into that virtual space again, and then go into the game itself. And that sort of smooth transition and integration and collaboration really is absolutely the key in order to build out ultimately an experience that people will appreciate. And if we can personalize it, then we can start monetizing it. And that then leads on into the VR space, which is basically that virtual studio idea, but an entirely personalized environment. You can bring in exactly what you want. You can have the map, you can have your favorite influencers, you could bring in the team, you can, and as much data and content we can extract from both the physical realm and the digital realm, we can mash together and create this very curated but personalized experience.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's been really exciting to see the developments of Weaver, particularly this year, and seeing an even bigger uptick of that tech that's been developed out to enhance viewer experiences and overall develop esports as an industry, and show that it's here to stay and it is resilient, as we've mentioned. Anna, you had the pleasure of going to Worlds in China, and your yoga mat went all the way with you in isolation. I'd love to hear about what it was like traveling to then go on set, and the use of, I would say, AR, augmented reality, by Worlds, and how that's been used, and KDA potentially, if you'd like to touch upon that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first, from a team point of view, it was a massive endeavor to go to China, and props to Riot for making it work. I think the safety protocols, we've got 50 pages in advance, you know, what to observe in terms of rules and what we should do if something happens. So it was a massive undertaking. It was a huge adventure. It was still, you know, a once in a lifetime experience, as it is always when players make it to Worlds and have the honor to participate at, you know, to fight for the crown in League of Legends. So however, now, you know, going into how it actually was, it was, I think it probably was the toughest challenge our players and our entire team environment had faced so far. From a competitive perspective, it was very tough that we went over there and then of course had to adhere to all safety protocols, which included being in a hotel for 14 days in single rooms with no human contact, honestly. So you'd get your food, you know, 3 times a day in front of your door, and that was that. So maintaining a good team morale was one of the biggest challenges I think I've ever faced as a manager. And then, you know, we survived that quite okay, I'd say, because of the routines I mentioned earlier, but it was still very tough. There is no way around that. That was incredibly tough. And then, you know, we proceeded to enter the team hotel. Now Shanghai had been an area at that time where there were no reported cases for, I think, months. So it was quite a safe environment. It didn't mean that there was free movement for our players. They were mostly confined to the hotel, but still, you know, it was a 5-star hotel. People, you know, could do things, and that helped quite a bit. And now then we moved to the studio where actually Worlds was broadcasted from, and that was amazing to see because, of course, it was a cutting edge technology. For people who haven't seen it, Riot created this amazing stage that showed Shanghai in the background, but it also showed an illusion of the stage for the first week to be high up in the air. So of course, you know, our players were instructed not, you know, to go over certain lines because then the illusion would have been destroyed. But that was amazing to see, you know, and all the thought that was put into it. So I think from a competitive point of view, I can only say kudos to Riot. They pulled it off. That was, you know, up to par with other events we've been to, from a competitive integrity point of view as well. Now, from a commercial point of view, I think from a team's perspective, and James mentioned it already, teams have been hit hard. You know, the moment the cameras go off, your inventory dies, in fact. So, you know, all your sponsors don't have any visibility. So, of course, now for Worlds, it was great. We added Kia back to our jersey. They were happy about it. It was in a studio environment. But on top of it, of course, you want to create all this shoulder content that, you know, makes it engaging and attractive to your fans. And again, during COVID, this is such a challenge because you need to be able to actually film this content, to create this content. So we've done our best, but to be fair, the quality suffers quite a bit when people can't be physically in one space. I think we experience this even now with this conference. It is tough to make something work in a digital environment only, but we've done our best. I think for us as a brand, it was wonderful to be part of Worlds because it gave us commercial opportunities we wouldn't have otherwise had, and that was great.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to kind of explore. I believe we've got 10 minutes. Yeah, that's right. We've got 10 minutes to kind of discuss the rest of divergence in esports response pandemic, and then we'll be going straight into a Q&A. So if you do have any questions for any three of us and to talk about, you know, players, organizations, broadcast, innovation, brand activation, and anything in the digital space relating to esports, please make sure you're getting those in, because we will address those for a further 45 minutes. So you've got plenty of time to explore deeper in some things that you may find interest from. But it would be really good to kind of maybe discuss what we think will remain as normal now, in terms of like our eyes were opened up and like, well, we would have never, as you mentioned, Anna, like you may have never done that fan activation should a pandemic never hit. So is there discussions happening, you know, and we have discussions at Hot Drop where it's like, okay, well, our offering as to a brand we need to give them a physical offering and a digital offering now, and really bring those together even more so. So it'd be really good to explore, Anna, with you first, like, what are some of these key takeaways from the pandemic and the way it's hit the business model, the way it's hit your kind of day-to-day operations, and had to like dig even deeper to find success in certain areas? What are some of those key takeaways you think are now going to become your new normal?
I think the biggest key takeaway is really that no matter what we do in terms of a fan offering, that is also connected, of course, to our sponsors and partners, that it needs to work in a digital environment, and ideally in a multifaceted way. So just again, to give you the example with Kia, in the course of this campaign, while we had ads in the beginning that were, you know, basically produced for a one-time use, we are now thinking that when we're working with partners, that everything we do should be highly entertaining and can be used multiple times to engage fans. That really has changed the way how we are approaching content. We also think that content overall needs to be more engaging, and even so a call to action, because the way people feel at home, quite isolated, it makes it tough to endure, you know, what COVID's doing to our social lives. So we are really thinking into a direction where we're changing overall the type of content we're producing together with partners. On top of it, I think on the very, you know, practical end, it just means that we had to make sure that we have all our resources in-house, that people can adhere to safety protocols and standards, and are willing, for example, to live with our team, or, you know, anybody who's involved in what we're doing, in kind of a bubble. So we protect each other and don't have too much social contact outside, which is quite tough, but I'm very happy and grateful that we have these very passionate employees who actually do that and commit to these safety standards.
Thanks, Anna. And James, in the world of broadcast and esports tournament organization, any new normals that you think you might see as standards now?
Many new normals. I think the biggest thing is the fact that we've completely turned the sort of workflow upside down once again. Just to remind you, you know, when we started this, I mentioned the fact that esports has always struggled with, in a way, budgets in order to get the content out there. You know, linear broadcast was just not an option. So the digital internet opportunity allowed that to happen. So every single stage, we've been analyzing, if you like, what we can deliver for the dollar or for the pound. And it's always had to have a direct impact to that fan or user in order for us to justify that spend. You know, back in the day, 2014, 2015, you know, we would almost struggle to consider a purchase of about $200 on a new capture card. And at the time, we'd be servicing, say, 20,000 concurrent viewers. To put things in perspective, obviously now we moved on a bit from $200, but what we've done is effectively kind of turned the workflow on its head, as I say, and created even more efficiencies. Now, the things that come from that isn't just cost savings. If there's cost savings in esports, it means we can spend money on other things. And one of the best things I think that's come out of it, and the thing I'm really excited about, is that with the more distributed workflow, we've completely opened up that talent pool, because now we're not relying on necessarily contributors, whether it's direct content creation or part of the production team, or any other sort of area of controlling, if you like, or narrating in this digital sphere. They can be anywhere pretty much. Like the latencies for broadcast are pretty good across the world, and that's really opened more opportunity to be more creative. Ultimately, the collaboration can be bigger, and obviously we all have an aspiration to get back into that physical space, because it's the premium experience. But we can bring all of these workflows with us. I think the second thing really is how we consider how using physical space actually, and blending that digital sphere. Like the opportunities you have, basically leaning on what would be used in Hollywood type stuff, with very large LED screens and virtual and AR components, now almost, or let's call it mainstream, to the extent that I think once we are back into a physical stage or stadium, we can really bring a lot more digital component to that. I mean, the esports industry was sort of renowned already for using a huge amount of LED walls. Our stages used to be just basically LED walls. Now I think there's going to be a lot more when it comes to augmenting that, and then creating even more an enhanced experience for that online viewer. And ultimately, as it always has been, as I said earlier, it's not we didn't do physical events for commercial reasons primarily. We did them for integrity and to create that hype moment. But in response to kind of looking at monetizing, I guess, we won't ever need to rely on necessarily, let's say, ticket sales. We can effectively now be very choosy or ambitious, or really challenge the status quo of what physical space we use. And I was looking at a really interesting development in Wales, where they're building out a big it's theatre, and obviously theatre is struggling right now for obvious reasons, but for one reason or another, many different reasons, they've clad this entire theatre with a big digital wall. That's really exciting. So it's really amazing to think how the more collaboration, the wider talent pool, and obviously our complete change within that physical space will really challenge everything and bring more creativity and collaboration.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think it will be really interesting to see as a fan, first and foremost, of esports, and then obviously having the pleasure to work in the industry. I was seeing when we bring it into a physical location, what space will be dedicated for what, because you couldn't have a virtual set on the stage of IEM and Spodek, because it will just hurt everyone's eyes because of the sheer amount of green screen that we would need. So there will still, in tandem, need the ability to have those LED screens, which in esports is programmed directly into the game. So if there's an item planted and it's being diffused, there'll be countdowns that then trigger other instances in the production workflows. And it's almost like we'll need to see a growth in not duplication, but taking advantage of that. You'll have viewers that will have a preference of seeing that virtual set from home, and you'll have people that want to still have the electric of the atmosphere, but still want to be there in a physical space, but not have their eyes bleeding from watching a green screen for and then walking around and the magic being slightly lost there. Do you think I'll throw to Anna first, and then James, have your input on that. Do you think that's going to be something hard to implement, or do you think we'll revert back to somewhat of digital being supplementary and the physical space being more of the go-to for things like, I know you can't have the crystal ball for things like LEC, but I'm sure these types of conversations could be starting to happen with the idea of vaccinations and wanting to get back on site as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I think obviously, from a team's perspective, we want to get on stage, back on stage ASAP. Mainly, I'll be honest, for inventory reasons. However, I think, the solution the LEC has found with broadcasting from the studio with their core team and then connecting to everybody else, especially the teams online, that has worked quite well. So I think on the very basic level, this is something we'll see more and more and more in terms of how tournaments are organized and broadcasted. But I also believe on the very top end, and I thought it was so interesting what James mentioned about the theatre and what they're doing. I think this is exactly what we've seen that happened during Worlds, where Riot put a lot of thought into a studio environment and how to make it work, in an augmented reality kind of way. So I should have mentioned that when you entered their studio, it was insane because actually all the walls behind the players and and the floors, there was all screens, and those screens were prepared to work out the illusion you saw, and that was amazing. But it was also a bit of scary because I saw like thousands of cables, and I was like, oh god, hopefully nobody trips over this because it looked very complicated. And so I think when we look at high-end productions, this is probably the direction we're going into. Obviously, since we don't have a studio, I don't know what goes into this to not make it a one-time thing like Worlds, but really to create this versatile environment where you can work with many tournament environments.
Thanks, James. So office environment means people are running past, and I didn't want to ruin the audio quality for 2 seconds. And James and I are in the same office. James, how do you make it so that it is still effective and efficient, to have all these options for esports? Are we in a position to be able to do that right now?
Yeah, and actually what's nice about obviously a government-led innovation project is that you're able to collaborate so much and really explore every single angle. And during that process, we actually looked at other funding rounds of different areas, and one thing was I think something that fascinates me is volumetric capture into a very sort of fine degree of accuracy. And I think trying to digitize the physical world is an ultimate gain because we can then blend that entirely. What I would challenge this with, though, is the fact that I think as humans, we look for a level of authenticity through the physical realm. It's kind of the vinyl LP effect of, why should you care about your music being printed on effectively vinyl compared to a very high quality digital stream? And it's because you kind of own it. So I think we have to be quite careful to get that balance really in a very correct manner. And while this virtual set technology, etc., and the graphics are just incredible, we had the NVIDIA launch just recently with the RTX stuff, and the amazing sort of real-time surroundings you can make. I think humans know it's still not real, basically, and some of the best sci-fi movies, etc., you kind of know that isn't a real thing. So what do we do to do that blend? Do we have to keep people in a physical form because we want to know that's flesh and blood sitting there right in front of us? So it's going to be it's an amazing space for research and some amazing companies and other R&D projects popping up that are looking at this stuff, and I'm super excited to see where it's going, because there's a lot to play with.
Yeah, it's an awesome industry, isn't it, guys? Like, it's like pretty epic that we get to work in it and talk about it. And we've got questions now, so I'm going to throw them, and I will also, if it's okay with you both, maybe throw my 2 cents into some of these as well, particularly with maybe the first question. So the first question comes from the audience. Thank you very much for submitting your questions. What can the esports industry do to appeal to a broader range of players, particularly more balanced between genders, which is, I think, somewhat of a question I pretty much get asked every time, mainly on a panel, because this is something that I guess from sports also, and we've had the opportunity to go to a lot of sports awards and conferences there, where innovative programs and schemes for women to be signposted towards sports and taking that up as a professional uptaking career is only quite recent still in cricket and football and rugby, and having those discussions about selling tickets for women's events. So this is something that I think esports is doing pretty well. I'm going to throw to Anna first on what you think can be doing, particularly with the fact that you know Global Rect has a huge inventory that he can tap into, and obviously takes seriously getting involved and making it an open space for everyone in esports, because that's truly what it is.
Absolutely. I believe we are, well, in esports, quite blessed to be in a new environment, at the forefront of digitalization that opens up a lot of opportunity to really overcome some social structures and construct that exist, I believe, in the old world. Now, having said that, looking at esports and the direction where we're headed, it is tough, I believe, to take on the challenge to create a more diverse environment, zooming into especially teams and peak performance in esports. On paper, there shouldn't be any hurdles for women to perform at the very same level as men. However, what you will see is that in most esports, you have all male teams competing. And by the way, so do we with Rogue and the Ravens. And this is, a topic where I have read a lot of research on, where I'm working with all our coaches to really see what are the reasons for this and how can we change the current state. Because what I want to see ideally are mixed teams competing, men and women side by side. I think one of the biggest challenges is really that once a certain environment is created that is mostly male, it is very tough for women to enter, to connect, just because it's an environment that's not naturally embracing who they are and what they do. So it is tough to get this together. So one thing we're doing at Red Global is working out a path to pro for females in the respective games. I think in League of Legends, this might be easier than in some other games. I really commend, for example, Riot Games for coming up with additional rules in their Valorant environment, where they have allowed teams to have, usually you have a one team rule because of conflicts of interest reasons, but in Valorant, at least for the next year, you'll be allowed to have an all male and all female team to really support teams in their efforts who want to overcome these hurdles. Overall, I believe we need to, if we want to change how teams currently look, what we really need to do is change the structures in esports from the very beginning, from a very young age on. I think our current society is still very focused on separating males and females at a certain age. That's just part of how we approach the topic. However, what we need in esports to work is that girls and boys play together, and they keep playing together over certain age periods, because while esports is partially high-end coordination, a lot of it is as well social interaction, how we communicate in an instant. And all these structures need to be built over social interaction. So one big investment we're going to make in the very near future is to have these youth programs where boys and girls will play side by side. But this is really a long-term play. I'd say nothing will change overnight here, but it is absolutely required that we put all our efforts into this, because I very much, as you and probably everybody, wants to see competitions where men and women fight side by side.
For sure, and I really agree with that, and I think that gets me more excited about the sport, is the potential of where it can go and what those players will bring to the fold, and you know, how that will potentially change gameplay or affect a meta patch update in a game, because actually they've brought a new thinking to the game and to the team execution in that as well, which is really exciting. James, you do a lot of grassroots work in the UK. IPs such as the ESL Premiership has a really important role to play, mainly I would say in the back office and backstage, and that is really allowed for women particularly to blossom in very integral roles. Could you just explain a little bit why that's so important to the scene, and what the Premiership's actually been able to develop talent wise?
Yeah, so yeah, it's not just the players, of course. It's the kind of the back end talent, the production staff, the tournament staff, the organizing aspects of the entire thing, and obviously the skills required in a similar way are completely accessible to both male and female. And we've always encouraged that. You're a great case in point, Heather. You know, I think ultimately, and Anna hits the nail on the head, I think it's just the type of genre that affects or attracts, let's say, a more male or female interest. And the gaming developers themselves are really doing a lot of work to make sure the IP is as mutually interesting, and that is working 100%. I always remember, Heather, when you were working at ESL with me, you kindly went to visit my old primary school.
Yeah.
And when you'd asked the entire classroom, obviously mixed classroom, who plays games, you know, every single hand goes up, and that obviously allows for that interaction. And I think it's just a matter of time in that respect. But going back to that sort of environment on the business side, you know, it's a really nice opportunity, and actually the collaboration between those two sort of different mindsets and contributions is only amplifying like the story we tell, and it's really good. But of course, it's not just male and female diversity either. Gaming is an amazing community, which is basically a majority community now, where it attracts all sorts of people across the world, and therefore, you know, race doesn't necessarily come into it as a major factor, because by default you're just expecting to be playing against or with all sorts of different people from all different backgrounds, and that's really exciting. And ESL actually runs a diversity initiative called AnyKey, which is a collaboration largely between Intel and MIT, also out of the States. And there's a lot of research done around, you know, both the fan base and to some degree the player base of our tournaments. And it goes to show that really the significant, let's say, problem lies between the male and the female side of things. But as you allude to, Heather, grassroots is a real opportunity to change that, because ultimately it's the doers, the people straight, you know, affecting what's going to happen in future. It's very exciting to even consider, you know, let's say the professional side of esports is only almost 5 years old now to some degree, and already you look at where people have come on in that time. You know, from I think when I first met you, you were a broadcaster at Jinx TV, and now you're running a very successful marketing firm yourself. I think that will just repeat and repeat and repeat, and that inspiration will help others, and those grassroots is where it will happen.
Thanks, James and Anna. Yeah, I think it's a level of, as Anna and James have both said, like a top-down. We're kind of working from the top down now, in terms of like driving that diversity across all areas of diversity. And really, 46% of women play games in the UK, and actually we're finding it's on different devices such as mobile. So it's building the infrastructures for mobile competitive player at a younger age, because the tech barrier to entry there is so much lower, and everyone's got a phone in the household. And it's how do we captivate them there, using it for educational purposes, but also promoting that competitive side and seeing it as a viable avenue. And so there's a lot of educational work going in from primary school, secondary school, and in higher education in the UK to kind of build across that multi-talent side of things. And I think we're starting to see that we can tell a lot more stories. The audience of the esports is very welcoming, and first and foremost, there have been notoriously problems with comms in just general public games, which have been known for toxicity. But we think the game publishers are working on that a little bit more and taking that somewhat more seriously, certainly more than when I started out trying to compete. I think overall, we're seeing a huge shift in that, and it's being a very conscious responsibility of everyone that wants to grow the industry to make sure that we are representing every type of esports fan there is in the world. And it does take time, unfortunately. It's not an overnight fix, but it is being worked on, and I think that's really exciting. And I think this kind of leads into our second question, which is what job opportunities in the esports industry should school leavers and recent grads be looking for in the future, which to me would be literally anything, but it'd be good to know some specifics potentially. Is there gaps in hiring at Rex Global that you're looking for, Anna, or in team roles, those people very fresh-eyed that are wanting to come in and shape the industry that they've grown up loving? How do they look for opportunities?
Well, I think on a very junior level entry, I'd agree with you. Everything's open. I think, of course, we are met with great passion for people who want to start out in the team management. I think very much like sports, this seems incredibly attractive to, work with the player superstars. If you want to do that, you don't even necessarily need to have a degree, in my opinion. Obviously, it's always a plus, but the main thing really is that you are a good project manager and can take care of people in a very individualized, personal way to support the high performance level. But obviously, look, I think tier 1 esports organizations are very professional by now. Of course, we hire in any department, whether it is marketing, whether it is accounting, operations, especially with regards to content. I'd like to get out that I think since we really work in such an innovative environment, we are looking for interesting profiles where people have experience, hopefully already, with how to create content in the digital environment, how to distribute. The entire distribution chain in esports, I think, is still very early stage, and that's an absolutely exciting opportunity, in my opinion. But this also makes it sometimes a bit tough. I don't know about James, but when it comes to hiring, looking at the profiles we are looking basically at someone who comes from the future sometimes, and fulfilling the roles we're looking for, because yes, sometimes it is really looking at the crystal ball and on what we're trying to create and sell. Yeah.
And just to add to that, I think it's very encouraging in the UK, especially the number of educational institutions that have been looking to the industry for a lot of advice and encouragement, I suppose, in how they can form, in effect, education led around esports. So, and hopefully it's come across that esports is extremely collaborative across various different industries and verticals, especially on the creative side of things. So the idea to effectively add, let's say, a module at a university degree or some a subject within some sort of further education will help apply esports understanding to other industries or skills that people are learning. And so I agree, Anna, the sometimes there's just not the people with the experience and the esports knowledge, which means you have to sort of educate some very experienced people in esports as they come into it. But there's countless examples of success in that area. The most important thing is knowing really that the person, the individual, is passionate about what esports is striving to do, and that's bringing people together and enjoying that, or celebrating that competitive play, and the strive for the best, let's say, of every level. And so it's very open, and generally speaking, that is very high on the level of interest when we employ. I've seen countless examples of individuals coming into the space, never having been to a big esports tournament, and once we've taken them to a big event, I think that their eyes are really opened. I mean, it was only 5-6 years ago that we would question the idea of people even watching other people playing video games. I think that was the sort of common headline we'd see from the BBC or another news outlet. That's moved on significantly now, and it's also exciting that we're starting to see the foundations of proper research in this space on the benefits and the social change that can come from competitive play or multiplayer gaming across the world and many different communities. And so if you're passionate and you're really good at what you do, there's lots of openings, and I'd really encourage anyone who's considering that to definitely approach these organizations. It's only growing, and as an industry, we're absolutely looking for those people to contribute.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think we're looking for constantly people that want to innovate the industry as a whole and not in one particular area, and can have that future vision, that big picture idea, and actually be confident in the way that they're like, well, I've got this, I'm onto a winner. And there's also opportunity to collaborate with the industry whilst studying, or you don't, as Anna said, I don't necessarily make it a specification that you have a degree when coming to work at Hot Drop, because you just can't measure by education sometimes versus experience and thoughts and ideas. And I think it's really key to engage. If you don't see job openings, and probably still engage with those organizations, because they're probably working on something behind the scenes, and you might be a little bit early, or you might have got them thinking in a way that goes, hey, we actually need to innovate in this way, and yes, we could make an opening, and let's collaborate and let's make it possible. And everyone's still very competitive in the space, whatever sector it is in esports. We all come from a competitive nature, and we all want to be the first to it, and so there's lots and lots of opportunity out there for everyone. I guess it nicely ties in to the fourth question. We've got 9 to get through, so I think we've got plenty of time. What are the skills the UK need to build up in the industry to make most of the opportunity of developing in the next few years? So I know we've been very broad in what we've discussed at the moment, saying there is opportunity, but is there maybe a certain area that you can identify that there might be lacking at the moment of a skill or a knowledge base? Anna, you touched upon distribution, and I would say that it's kind of still not a set process for content and marketing, and everyone's trying a bit of A/B testing all the time. But is there a particular area and we can explore marketing further, or elsewhere in Rect Global that you would think, hey, we probably need innovators here, or we need to develop, or the industry as a whole even?
Well, I think what's so exciting and interesting about the industry we work in is that we look at content creation, digital platforms, and its distribution. And it's an ever-changing landscape, even on an accelerated timeline, where you see new platforms popping up, TikTok, to mention as the latest. So I believe there is not necessarily a lack of understanding, but what I can tell you from a marketing point of view is that in terms of data-based assessment, we're still lagging behind when it comes to making use of all these platforms. I think we have settled a bit more with some that have been around for longer. For example, we work with, Nielsen when it comes to our LEC data. Nielsen well established and well respected from the sports space. So that works out well. But when it comes to really showing what effect it has when you market on digital platforms and how, and I think, but that's just the very nature of the space we're working in. It's so new that it takes a bit of time to develop reliable methods. And I can only say that, especially when it comes to data analysis, from a team's perspective, most teams I know in the tier 1 space are currently looking to hire or have already hired their in-house data analysts, just because they don't seem to get the offering by third parties, and we need to come up with creative solutions on our end to really cover that area.
Thanks, Anna. James, anywhere in broadcast innovation that you, or anywhere in the industry that you think skills are required to be built up in the industry?
I think Weaver's probably testament to show that the UK is actually in a very, very good place for this. When we set out to look for partners to collaborate, it was quite straightforward, really, to find a huge amount of skill and very amazing ideas from the consortium partners that came together and contributed. So I think we were very much an events-led country. I think naturally we want to be collaborative. There's a lot of very positive things that I've certainly witnessed coming out of Innovate and DCMS's strive to encourage this sort of behavior and support and build. So I think if I was to sort of put some suggestion to, say, the UK as a whole, I think what I would really encourage is more collaboration on a kind of geographical basis. Ultimately, esports is an international market at its premise. We have to look at the whole world as a competitive market. Obviously, Brexit doesn't necessarily help in this instance for obvious reasons, but we need to create, let's say, a foundation or an opportunity for IP, whether it's a tournament or a team or a game, to kind of really want to position the event or whatever it is being created on the ground, which obviously then creates an opportunity for people to come together and collaborate on. And I think if we do, I think a lot of cities and councils and other sort of more formalized groups of I don't know, let's say landlords or whatever, come together and think about what they can offer the industry to make a home for this encouraging thing. I mean, a good example here is I was speaking to a team in the UK called Endpoint. They have just they're the first CS:GO team to actually qualify into Pro League, which is very, very exciting. And they're desperate to find and build up a home and innovate around their own brand and their own team. And and they happen to be based in Sheffield. And it would be amazing to see the, how industry, the creative industry and the council, let's say, to come together and say, hey, let's work together. You've got some significant growing IP in esports, and you have an aspiration to be on the ground in Sheffield. Let's make that happen and come together. And that's what I would really love to see. And certainly we've had a lot of support ourselves. Not just through an innovation project with Weaver, but also, the support we've had from the West Midlands, the council there. We've operated very large flagship events at the arena in Birmingham, but also run lots of gaming stuff at the NEC, and Andy Street specifically has given a huge amount of support to what we're doing, and the council, as well as overall city support, let's say. There's basically massive opportunity. Esports doesn't always have to be that big global. Oh, sorry, that's my Google Home speaking to me. It doesn't always have to be a big flagship event. I can talk about lots of okay things. Then Google, yeah, this is AI fail. I think it can be a small thing as well. We talk about the grassroots aspect, and we just were recently involved in a diversity esports initiative that was in a southern London borough. Very specific, much smaller, but with a big impact. It went out online at the end of the day. So there's, and you look across the country, there's all sorts of theatres and other venues that are looking for some sort of uplift and another angle to diverge themselves. Well, esports is a perfect example, but I just want to say it's not an overnight thing, and there's not instant success from esports. You really have to build and grow a campaign. I was quite encouraged to see the Wolves football team just bring in, start effectively a grassroots esports team. That's the right way to approach it. You don't just need to suddenly buy the best roster for several million and then try and get straight into the LEC or a big league. You can do so much more with the community and with creative collaboration to build it from scratch and all benefit in the long term.
Thanks, James. We've got a couple more questions. We've got about 15 minutes, I believe. So I'm going to try and do them in relevancy to each person, because I think some of them are better. There's one that is aimed at Anna. So Anna, I'm going to ask you this one directly. It's from Jenny Jordan. Thank you. It says, Anna talked about how you were supporting players to be resilient and how the game experience is changing. Managers and other staff are also being pushed extra hard during this period and expected to adapt to huge changes in their working life and workflows. What do you think organisations can and should do to support them too?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. We have put a lot of thought into this topic actually on our end, I think we had this huge advantage because I mentioned our high performance environment that we had set up. Now, to dive a bit deeper into this, what we're thinking is that if you want a high performance environment for your players, you need to make sure that actually everybody who is in contact with players buys into this model and is actually part of this model. So when I talk about high performance environment, what do I mean? It means that people support each other with their high performance approach while being still autonomous in the way they approach it. So you can already see, like, the guy who sets it up in our organization, he's a highly intellectual human being, so I love that. So there is all scientific method to what we do. Now, looking at the additional staff, managers, coaches, all of them follow this model. So this means in terms of how you approach your workflow, how you interact with others, there is always a part in your work where you have room to reflect on what you're doing, to share this with your environment, and to get better in a support about what you're doing in a very supported, positive way. Now that can mean that our performance coaches interact also with the other staff doing that. For example, we have group sessions where basically everybody participates when it comes to, for example, developing the values of our team, which really go beyond of the LEC team. That, you know, goes very much to what are our performance values in REC Global. So what we do is that we look at our management the way we look at an esports team, and we make everybody be part of it. And I believe that's a bit unique, you know, looking at other esports teams, how they're doing it. But what we have found is keeping everybody so close actually helps in terms of setting up good work culture and being really on the same page when it comes to how we are doing things in REC Global, in Rogue, in Ravens.
Thanks, Anna. I guess, James, I have a question for you from the wonderful audience here and conference partakers, which I'm sure you'll be passionate to answer. What impact will 5G have on the esports industry?
I think it's multifaceted. You'll be pleased to hear. Effectively, it's the delivery of an experience. So in effect, if you think about a very relatively young audience, the last thing that our audience want to do is be depicted on how they consume and interact with competitive gaming and entertainment. So the ability to just swap from device to device and be basically always connected and consume the ultimate experience, which obviously requires 5G technology, is important. We've actually started some work exploring how latency come into play there as well, because it's very important that you can switch from device to device in a complete smooth transition. And again, 5G really helps. Distributed cloud computing or fog computing, if you like, is really important. And also the contribution of content. We believe that, again, to provide the most personalized experience whatsoever, we need to look far beyond just the content creators around the linear feed. It's all of the other contributors, and in fact pretty much every member of the audience is a contributor in a way. And obviously there's a tiering of contribution in terms of individual analytics or perceptions or humor or whatever that will attract a smaller subgroup of audience, and you should be able to blend that all together. So being in the field or in the stadium or whatever, it's really important that capacity of bandwidth can deliver that contributive behavior. And then of course it's the gameplay as well, which is interesting, because we think about the barriers of entry with esports. Traditionally speaking, esports were largely PC orientated games, the keyboard and the mouse. We nicknamed the master race, which has been something that's stuck since about 1999, because effectively it's the best form of human computer interaction right now. You get the most amount of input into a computing device through hundreds of keystrokes a minute, and very, very fast mouse movements and clicking, etc. Think back to that pro gamer who can tell the difference between 144 and 60 hertz. And but that landscape's changing completely. Obviously we have the controller, and we also have, most importantly, mobile phones. Mobile phones are extremely accessible. Obviously a huge amount of people have them, but they only have a certain amount of power, obviously. So we need to consider the distributed computing methods and delivery again of high bandwidths and latency, low latencies, to effectively dumb devices. And we're starting to see examples of distributed computing through the likes of Google Stadia. I've just got to make sure my Google is now muted, and Apple Gaming and many others. So this is just a trend, I think. I also started to explore really exciting prospects that we allude to the fact that these latencies can be significant when you come to high-end gameplay. What happens if you basically can service a more grouped community with the ultimate premium experience when it comes to the reduced latencies to game against each other? If servers now live in the mast in a city rather than in a server in Amsterdam, let's say, that experience can be better if you're now more geographically located. And we've got examples of this. Some players will actually pay for server access, which gives a better latency. So I think that's a really interesting area to explore. If anyone's read Ready Player One, like the concept of basically living closer to the servers to get a better experience, it's kind of similar to that. So there's a huge amount more, and there's a lot to explore with it, but it definitely fits, and there's a lot of exciting areas we can explore forward.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I think the infrastructure potentially needs it in the UK a little bit more, where we can not have to dig up roads as much, potentially, and be able to still bring esports tournaments to places. We are wrapping up, and so I'd love to take some final words and notes inspired by one of our questions in here. We've touched upon it slightly, but it would be good to kind of bring that message home. And so, Anna, it would be really good to know from this question, with your final thoughts of divergence and the resilience of esports when tournaments with live audiences return, and I appreciate there's going to be a bit with a crystal ball, what will be the main ways they will differ from pre-pandemic events? Any notes on that, Anna, would be amazing.
I believe the way tournaments will return is, and honestly, I'm super excited about this. I think we have now put so much work and energy into making tournaments live in a digital environment fully. So now going back to LAN events, hopefully at some point in the future, just means that there will be better entertainment for the fans out there. I believe there will be more innovative inventory to work with. And overall, there will be, well, I'm sure about that, a better process for players, how they participate. There will be more efficiency around that, just because we appreciate now how these processes are done. We have these strict safety protocols. Once this is lifted, I would assume that everybody thinks like, oh, wow, this is really easy and amazing what we're doing. So overall, I believe everything we
pandemic, and thank you all for submitting your questions as well. Anna, if people would like to get hold of you outside of this, where can they find you?
I mean, obviously, you can always reach me by email. That's anna@recglobal.com. Other than that, you're welcome to follow me on Twitter @AnnaBaumann. I think this is where you can get the latest esports takes and some, of course, pre-Christmas pictures from our home as well.
Amazing. And James, where could they find you if they want to talk about, you've already plugged Weaver.tv, but where could they find the talk about Weaver and other innovative esports things?
Best is probably through Twitter, for myself @J1MCO, which is my old gamer tag, and then also eslgaming.com for the latest action from our side on the tournament level, and Weaver without an E between the V and the R .tv. There's a contact email on there. Hopefully, if any conference exists, this is the one where the best creative minds come together, and I would love to hear from anyone with some more ideas and other technology insights, etc., for further collaboration. We finished the project June this year, and we've got lots of plans beyond, so I'm very, very keen to hear from people.
Thank you so much. And that wraps up our panel. James and Anna, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.